Right. Morning, everybody. Is it good to be on this early in the morning after on the last day after what I hope was probably quite an entertaining evening? I was watching. You were all having fun with the late night bar and so on. I was watching the videos of Monday to find out what you've been up to, which I have to say it was good viewing. I got halfway through the Q&A session and my kids interrupted me, so I don't actually know really what happened in the Q&A session. But you had some good speakers on Monday, so hopefully I'm not going to disappoint you. Good morning, Matt Roberts. I'm not going to read that title, but you can all thank Jill for that one. I didn't know I was going to talk about this until she sort of sent it through to me, and it's like, oh, okay, fine, well, I think there's something to talk about. I'm the Global Sustainability Strategy Director for Interserve PLC. Some numbers about Interserve. I like to do this to audiences, particularly first thing in the morning. Put your hand up if you've ever heard of Interserve. Ooh, do you know, I didn't expect that, because normally when I talk to a corporate audience, about 3 hands go up.
Because you told us, Matt.
Oh, bugger. All right, edit that out of the bit that goes on the web. Okay, we've been around for a while, about 140 odd years. We're a global construction and outsourcing business. Here's some numbers a bit about who we are and what we do. There's about 85,000 of us, about 50 odd thousand here in the UK, 25,000 in the Middle East, and about 10,000 spread out all over the place. Interesting other things is we operate on all 7 continents, which I think as a corporate is quite rare. Because we have looked after bits of the British Antarctic Survey, and we currently do quite a lot in the South Atlantic for the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence and people like that. We do a lot in the retail sector. We're currently doing an awful lot in the energy from waste sector and the renewable sector in our buildings life. We're the largest land management business, which some of you will know because of my landmark experience in the past. We have a big footprint in the Middle East, as I've said, and at the moment we've just started work on another one of those enormous, great big towers in London. For those of you that know the Nine Elms area of London, the area around the new Covent Garden Market and the Flower Market, right on the end of that, next to the Flower Market, there's going to be a thing called One Nine Elms, which is 2 enormous, great big luxury apartment complexes, £900 million worth of Chinese investment into that bit of the river. And every time I'm in London and staying in London, I ask a bit of the Thames that I run along in the morning. I'm one of those terrible people. And I look at this site and I go, how on earth can you get 100 stories of construction and a hotel into 2 hectares? But apparently you can. And we're also about to start work building the new Defence National Rehabilitation Centre up in the Midlands, which is quite exciting. So that's the business that I work in. Some of you will know me of old because I used to be a ranger on the Gower. And actually it wasn't that long ago. So the world has changed a bit. And I think that is sort of vaguely relevant to what I'm going to say now. And we have this marvellous statistic about the fact that we complete, as a construction company, 1 new building project every year. Now I'm going to try and play you a YouTube video because I think it's quite a good way to start this subject. And when we tried this beforehand, it did work. So let's see.
I am the rainforest. I watched them grow up here. They've left, but they always come back. Yes, they always come back. For my trees, their wood, my plants, their medicines. For my beauty, their escape. I've always been there for them, and I have been more than generous. Sometimes I gave it all to them. Now, gone forever. But humans, they're so smart, so smart. Such big brains and opposable thumbs. They know how to make things, amazing things. Now why would they need an old forest like me anymore? Jungles, trees. Well, they do breathe air, and I make air. Have they thought about that? Humans, so smart. They'll That'll be fun to watch.
Anybody see that before? Good.
It's going to automatically play the next video because it's YouTube.
Oh, is it? What do I need to do? Something impressive? That'd be quite challenging. Hang on.
Just play a couple.
There we go. We want that, don't we? That's where we were, and we did that. So it's not as elegant as it could be, but anyway. Okay. The reason I wanted to play that because it had a kind of really profound effect on me. I was sitting in a hotel room in Warsaw a couple of weeks ago, and that came on the TV. I just switched the telly on because it's, you know, what do you do in hotel rooms other than things like that? And that came on, and actually what got me was that if you see that on the sort of CNN international feed, it has this hashtag, nature doesn't need people. And for me, that's really important about moving on the debate, about some of the stuff that we might want to think about now around economics and people and change and the relationship between the environment and progress and growth, because I've always felt that sometimes we get this wrong. We slip into the sloppy language of talking about saving the planet. And the bottom line is the planet doesn't need saving, our species does. And I think that's what we, in a very small way, are trying to do in this room. And what we in the corporate sector increasingly are very, very motivated by. Because we know we've got lots of responsibilities in this sector. And we know that sometimes we don't get it right, but we're trying. For those of you that want a few more good laughs as well as some sort of heartstring moments, because it's CI, Conservation International. It's very American, but it's very well done. The Julia Roberts one is particularly good when she talks about having fed species greater than you and having starved species greater than you. All of them are brilliant. Have a look at them and use them if you've got an appropriate audience. I hope you are. I thought I'd put this one up. This is the Stockholm Resilience Institute, the Equator Principles. And have most of you seen this before? Yes, no? Is it new? Okay. It sort of says, you haven't seen it before? Okay. This has been around for a while now, but it talks about where we are in terms of sort of planetary boundaries. The red stuff is where we are way over the planetary boundaries. We're way over what we can cope with. Can you read that? So this bottom corner, where it's really, really bad, that's biodiversity loss. Okay, so we're stuffed on that one, basically. Over here, it's the nitrogen cycle, so that's excessive nitrification of the systems, and the one at the top that is breaching the limits, or getting on to breaching the limits, is climate change. And we're all aware of the fact that we've got a very big moment coming up at the beginning of December in Paris, where hopefully there might be some universal agreement. I'm not enormously optimistic that governments can agree, but I can be reasonably confident around the fact that the NGO community, civil society, and the corporate sector are probably all going to be on the same page. And it doesn't really matter where they come from in the world, whether or not we're talking about the Chinese or the North Americans, the South Americans, the Australians, the Europeans, the Africans. Generally speaking, they're all pretty much on the same page when it comes to issues around climate change. The people who are probably going to have the most problems, once again, are the global government and the politicians. The interesting thing for me about that, and we'll get onto this a bit later, is that water at the moment is not perceived as being a big issue. But this is the 2009 edition from this, because it's the only one I could find in Nature. But the Stockholm Resilience Institute do keep republishing updated versions of this, and the numbers just get worse. But we kind of know most of this, don't we? So, I mean, I am sort of, generally speaking, preaching to the converted when it comes to this sort of stuff. So I thought I'd talk a bit about the kind of growth agenda. The Limits to Growth was a very profound publication for me as an undergraduate. I am that old. That was still relevant and current. It was quite profound because it was the first time that people have started to think about the future in a resource limiting way. And you know, it had quite a lot of traction, and from that I suspect we could probably track the theory of sustainability and economic growth through Brundtland to today from the work of the Club of Rome. Because the Club of Rome had a big impact on me as an undergraduate, when Jürgen Randers brought out an updated version of that a couple of years ago, looking at the next 40 years, I felt obliged to buy and obliged to read. And to be honest, I wish I hadn't, because it's a fantastically depressing read. It really, because I mean, literally, there is a section at the back which talks about some of the things that you personally might like to do, and it's got recommendations like, if you're really interested in biodiversity, go and look at it now because it's not going to be around in the future. If you're looking for somewhere to live, make sure it's really climate resistant. So it's not a very, very optimistic read. And actually, I think that message is a bit old-fashioned. It's a bit tired. We need to find a different way of communicating how we, the people who are responsible for bits of the environment and bits of sustainability and bits of nature and bits of protected landscapes, how we communicate with the rest of the world about the opportunities that are out there to make a difference and to create change. And the last one on the right was one of those books where on Christmas Day you open this book and you don't know what you're going to get, and and it's come from a member of your family, and you realise that in a moment of desperateness, they were standing in Waterstones, probably on the 23rd of December. I thought, I've got to buy Matt a present. God, what can I buy him? Oh, he's a dull bugger. I'll buy him a book about GDP. I mean, it's a short and affectionate history. And I have to say, any book about GDP is unlikely to be a cracking page-turner. But this does a pretty good job of trying to explain GDP, which when you're talking about economic growth, actually a reasonably decent understanding, just at the kind of newspaper reader level, at the Radio 4 listener level, is quite helpful. And it taught me a huge amount about the artifice of growth and how we see growth and how we think about GDP. If I can do anything for the sales of Diana's book, then I suggest that if any of you are interested in understanding a bit more about GDP, it's quite a good bath read, leaving next to the loo or whatever, however you do that, and you might find you have some quite long baths, because I certainly did. It's quite good. She goes through the history of GDP, which was the whole reason for calculating this was originally put together at the latter end of the Second World War, and mostly came into the fore when we were trying to understand how to reconstruct Europe in the late 40s and the early 50s. We didn't really think about GDP until about 1943, and it didn't really come to the fore in terms of economic policy making and growth kind of concept until the mid to late 40s and the early 50s, and it saw us all the way through the post-war reconstruction, the Marshall Plan and all that sort of stuff, and then it has been a reasonably kind of loyal subject of the peaks and troughs of life since it first came to the fore. She begins to look at the future about some of the things that on the growth agenda where this GDP metric isn't going to be particularly helpful, and she highlights sort of three areas. And I'm conscious of the fact there's at least one economist in the room. Put your hand up. From FTech.
He went yesterday.
He went yesterday. Oh, thank God. Okay, right. I can say a bit more now, maybe, and not feel completely stupid. She talks about three things. She talks about complexity and how GDP is not a very good measure of complexity. She talks a lot about how the way we make things now is if you make an iPhone or a smartphone, let's be non-brand specific here, all of the GDP calculations around that phone basically end up in the economy of where it's sold, not in the various bits of the economies around the globe where things are made. And the supply chain for everything in this room, including the clothes on your back and the shoes on your feet and the devices in your pockets, and probably the constituent parts of your badge, have come from around the planet. And GDP is a really rubbish measure of that complexity. It just simply says, well, it was sold in Britain, therefore it accrues to the British economy. All of the other impacts are not really factored in. Shoes, cars, computers, houses, jobs, holidays, healthcare even, and drug therapy. And she talks about mass customisation and the role of how customisation means that we're not going to make as much stuff in the future as we do today. At the moment, there is a standard curve for sizes of clothes and shoes and everything else. And we make more than we need to meet the market. And in a world of mass customization, we're not going to be doing that, so we're going to be making fewer things. There's going to be less waste. So resource efficiency has a small chance of extending, which is quite good news in many cases for lots of things, but not for GDP. So we need to think about that. And then when we get into the sharing economy debate, GDP completely falls flat on its face. Can't cope with the sharing economy at all. She then talks about the whole dematerialization thing and how GDP cannot measure the value of a Google search. Google reckoned that free search is worth $160 billion a year to the global economy. That's quite a big number. But GDP doesn't recognise that at all. It just recognises the bottom line profits of Google, which are substantial, but they're not 160 billion. Not yet. And she also goes on to talk a bit about the robot economy and the role that that will have, and how we're going to go through an interesting phase in our lives, very similar to the Industrial Revolution, where we saw the decline of weavers. And the rise of the loom, and a really difficult readjustment in economic terms, whilst all those people that used to make a living doing hand weaving became machine minders, and it took us a while to work out how we kind of reconstruct the wealth that is created through mechanisation, and we distribute it around the country. And the reason I'm talking to you a bit about some of this stuff is because I think if you're going to talk about environment and economy, we need to kind of understand some of the metrics that we're using. And she finally gets on to talk about the role of sustainability in GDP. And I know Howard alluded a bit on the first day, see, I have been watching the video, about the whole natural capital accounting thing and ecosystem services. And she begins to sort of look at that, but mostly looks at the fact that our GDP measure at the moment has absolutely no real way of calculating the future impact of resource use. And resource use is a huge issue. The circular economy and waste is a big issue at the moment. I was in Europe on Friday with one of Ian's colleagues from National Grid and JLR and BT, talking to the Commission about their new circular economy package and how they're thinking through the waste agenda around that. And that resource efficiency thing is really important. I was talking to the ICE, Institute of Chartered Civil Engineers, a couple of days ago. Again, all about the circular economy and waste and how we design this stuff out. But how do we cope with the fact that a lot of the things that we have in our lives today were designed and then made before the concept of the circular economy came along? And we are still, in the civil engineering world, if you want to have a fantastically successful career in civil engineering, you are generally speaking told that the really sexy jobs are in the new build. You know, great civil engineering, the stuff that we celebrate around the planet, is about new bridges, new dams, new hospitals, new buildings, not life extension of a motorway. If you can take a motorway and make it last 3 times longer, you really want your best and brightest minds working on life extension of infrastructure, not building new ones. And talking to the Institute of Civil Engineers, who maybe don't own the industry, but they certainly own the profession, and they have a massive influence over what people are taught at the beginning of their careers, where how we celebrate great engineering. We don't celebrate great engineering in terms of life extension and refurbishment. We talk about great civil engineering in terms of these marvellous new pieces of things that we've built, which uses everything for new. And then she goes on to talk about how we need to rethink and readjust our concept of growth around GDP, and how we're beginning to make a move because, for instance, it is now acceptable to view spending on R&D as an investment, not a cost, which until 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't realise this until I read this startlingly exciting book, R&D investment was a cost. R&D spending was a cost, not an investment. And we need to think about that in terms of the environment as well. And I wrote at the bottom of my notes, growth, Jim, but not as we know it, because that's what kept running around inside my head. And there is an enormous place, I think, for kind of landscapes in this, and nature. And it's not about the technical matters of GDP. It's more about how do we actually create the markets for it, because in the whole natural capital debate that's been going on, the thing that struck me is that the people in this room There is not a single natural capital or ecosystem service that if somebody was to come along and offer to buy it off you, you couldn't sell them. We have a very distorted market at the moment in terms of there's lots of offer out there, but there's nobody to buy it. And I think we have to do quite an important thing, certainly something I'm campaigning on, and please join in if you feel like it, which is we have to stop talking about payment for ecosystem services and payment for natural capital. We have to talk about buying things. Because by changing the language, we can change the way we think about this stuff. So we need to stop thinking about, we've got to find the buyers for this stuff. So the water companies are already quite good buyers of natural capital and ecosystem services. But beyond that, in terms of the new models and new markets, there's not much out there. Now, the food market is still very much a commodity thing, as are the extractives and everything else. We've got to think much more about buyers for natural capital and buyers for ecosystem services. And I know some people won't like the idea of putting a price on nature or putting a price on natural services, but probably we need to do that. You're fed up with looking at that slide? So let's look at another one. This is quite an interesting read for anybody who feels that way inclined. This is KPMG's piece of work on megatrends, came out in 2013. Those are the top 9 megatrends which they have identified. Demographics is a fairly obvious one, ageing population. They focus very much on the cost of an ageing population and the very competitive nature we're going to have between young people wanting to find work and old people who are effectively job blocking, which is going to be an interesting challenge. The rise of the individual, if you read this, and if you also then read Owen Jones's book called Chavs, have you come across that? Great read, that is a cracking read. He talks in there about the rise of the individual concept, and the polity of the last 30 years has moved from collective to individual. We're now interested in individual rights, and we're not interested in collective rights. And I think for the landscape community, that's quite a big change, because a lot of the protected landscapes that we currently have today and natural access rights come from a concept of collective benefit, not from a concept of individual benefit. You might say right to roam is an individual benefit thing, but it's probably one of the very few. So that's quite an interesting change. Enabling technology is another one. And I'm not going to go on about that, but you all know what I mean. It's about having fantastic technology in your pocket all the time. Economic interconnectedness is again going back to the global markets thing. Public debt. Now I think it's already been referred to that here that the economic times are going to be difficult if you are largely funded from the public purse. So public debt is still rising around the world, and it's going to have a big impact. The shift of economic power to places like China and India and Southeast Asia. Our 19 Elms project that I referred to at the beginning is a Chinese joint venture. It is interesting to actually be on the front line of experiencing what the Chinese definition of joint is. Climate change, we all know about. Resource stress, we've talked about a bit. And urbanisation, I think, is quite an interesting one because we are seeing a phenomenal increase, and it's only going to keep moving in that direction of people moving into cities. The ICE presentation workshop that we were doing was very much focused on how do you cope with this increasingly urbanised population. And I think that is a massive challenge. It's a massive challenge for protected landscapes, because increasingly some of our more recent protected landscapes that have been designated have had huge urban components right next to them, which is not unusual. I mean, when I worked on the Gower, we had a big city of Swansea next door to us. That was quite unusual. Quite a lot of our pre-existing protected landscapes were quite remote, but now we're designating protected landscapes very close to the edge of urban fringes, which means there is going to be some serious conflict between the requirement for housing and everything that goes along with it, and how do you keep your landscape protected. Moving on to the other bit that Jill asked me to think about was the value of collaboration across economic and environmental sectors. Anybody seen this before? This is the RSPB's scorecard for their Saving Nature strategy. Can you read that at all? No, I'm really sorry about that. I'm not going to read it all out to you. It's in their annual report. I suggest you go and have a look at it if you really want to go through it in detail. But they talk about things here. They're talking about a world richer than nature. You can probably see this bit. A growing support for nature. Excelling in nature conservation, and one team for nature. The interesting thing about this is, and I need my glasses for this bit, I do apologise for that, is they start off with some really good kind of motherhood and apple pie stuff in that 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock section, where they talk about protecting our finest sites and restoring habitats. They then just move to just past midnight or midday in that 1 o'clock zone, and you can't see that, but it says everyone will see the RSPB as leading on saving nature. So, whilst there's a lot of thought about collaboration, there are some very major players in the game who maybe needs to revisit some of their thinking. And for those of you who work in that particular part of the sector will understand that there's a real ambition from an ornithocentric organisation to have a much wider footprint. And I don't have a problem with that in some respects, because they do a very good job. But we do need to kind of like work very closely with some of these organisations, because without that, we're not going to make any sense out of it. But it's a very good strategy, and it's very well thought out. And the one thing we all know about the very big organisations is they know how to deliver this stuff. So I would urge people to go and have a look at that. And on to the more interesting kind of bit of this maybe. So this is the bit that I quite liked when Jill sent me her sort of briefing note, which is what are the 3 big environmental threats to the economy, in my opinion? Okay, so that's my Jerry Clarkson impression, over and done with. The obvious first one is climate change. I can absolutely assure you that anybody who's working in the business sector is thinking very hard about how this impacts them. Anybody who has a long-term view on any sort of project that they're working on or a relationship they're working on will be thinking about this. So it doesn't matter whether or not it's how do you clean a William Hill Bookmakers, and we clean a lot of those, or how do you build a new building for a government. It doesn't matter where you do it in the world, you're thinking about climate change, you're thinking about adaptation and resilience, and future-proofing. And there is this whole thing about, are we interested in resilience? Are you interested in a resilient landscape, a landscape that can absorb a shock and keep functioning? Or are you interested in a future-proof landscape that can actually embrace the change that's coming along and move with it? And I think we probably need to move some of our thinking into that space of being future-proof, not just resilient. Because resilience to shock means, okay, fine, I can absorb the punch and continue along as I am. And the world isn't like that. The one thing that we learn from Darwin was not necessarily the fittest survive, but the most adaptable survives. It's all about adapting to the impacts that we have. So I would argue that we don't want to think about resilience in climate change. We need to think about future-proofing, which is how do we deliver with a new landscape that is a post-climate change landscape, rather than how do we make our landscape resilient to climate change. Because I'm not sure you can do that. The next one, as I alluded to earlier on, is water. Whilst the Stockholm Institute doesn't think water is an issue, any other global risk matrix you care to look at will have water in the top 3. It doesn't matter about the World Economic Forum, whether or not it's the CIA, whether or not it's the UK government. Water is in the top there. And water is a key product of a lot of our protected landscapes. Whether or not it's in a rain-abundant or a water-abundant bit of Wales, or as I learned at a previous AOMB conference, in the eastern counties where Norwich has the same rainfall as Tel Aviv. Were you in the room for that one? Yes. Yeah. That really got, and the idea of recycled water is the only thing that keeps our river systems moving in the eastern counties. I think so. Water has lots of different dimensions to it, and we need to think about it more than just a scarcity model. And the last one is the lack of talent. Now, looking out at this room, put your see. There's another pop quiz. I'm sorry, but it is early in the morning, and I thought this was the best way to do this. Put your hand up if you've got an undergraduate degree. Okay, great. Leave it up. Exercise, keeps the blood flowing. Now move your toes like this. Okay, stops deep vein thrombosis. No. Now take your hand down if you had to pay for it. So did you pay a tuition fee? Take your hand down. So most people's hands are still up. Good. Okay, now you take your hands down. So for me, this is a really, really big issue for the environmental sector. At one point I put environmentalists up there, then I thought, no, actually that's probably wrong. It is a lack of talent. Now we are looking at the fact that most of the people in this room, I mean, you know, the entry ticket to our industry is an undergraduate degree. Increasingly, it's a postgraduate degree. We could do a similar test around postgraduate degrees, but we won't, unless you want to use the other hand, because most of us got funded for this. And this isn't a political point I want to make, it's an economic point I want to make. We are now asking not the next generation of people who are going to be sitting in these seats, but the generation after that, mostly speaking. I'm judging by the number of people who are as follically challenged as I am, or to make this assumption. But not the next generation, but the one after that, who are going to be coming out of our academic institutions with a debt level of around £50,000 under the current model. Anybody who've got children in that world, you might have been conning yourself, it's less than that, but let's just go for 50 grand, you know, plus or minus a few. But it's going to be about £50,000. Now, if you have got a debt at the age of 23, 4 of £50,000, where are you going to go to manage that? Because I absolutely assure you that in a model where you know we're looking to buy houses and all the rest of it, having a £50,000 debt around your neck, even if it's kind of like it's senior debt to the government and all the rest of it, and it is going to be factored into people's lives. And I am genuinely worried about where the pipeline of talent is coming from and what are we teaching them. So I think a really, really big threat to the protected landscape sector and to the economics argument is, where are those really smart people going to? I mean, this is a room full of smart people. You're all smarter than I am. And where are you going to come from? And where's your replacement going to come from? And where's the replacement before that, after that, going to come from? I think that personally is very, very important, and we are not thinking about it. I know there was a session on professional qualifications for protected landscapes, but we really need to think about that one really hard, because we need really bright people who can cope with what's coming down the pipe. To be able to deliver the services that we, and protect the landscapes that we all feel kind of really passionate about. And I feel really passionate about those landscapes. Part of putting up that video right at the beginning is just to say that this means something to me. I may do the corporate nonsense in a suit, but it still means quite a lot to me. It means a huge amount to me. And I am really worried. You know, I've just been through the process of recruiting a bunch of people into our business, some of them very senior people. And actually it was, we got some really good people in the end, but there was an awful lot of stuff out there, people out there who just were okay. Maybe slightly better than okay, but they didn't knock your socks off. And I bet every one of you in this room, when you were sat down and interviewed, you knocked the socks off the people on the other side of the table. And we need people who will do that, who are passionately committed to this, and are genuinely worried about where they're going to come from. And as you go and talk to people in the NGO community about where do you find a botanist, or where do you find a botany degree, they're very rare. The same applies to zoology and archaeology. There's quite a lot of ecologists around still, but the numbers are going down. People are not signing up to these things at that level, and we do need to address that, and we do need to use some of the voice and that ability to convene that this community has to talk about that. Okay? So that's the end of my rant. That's how you can find me. And if you ever want to, probably after this you will never will. Thank you very much.